Welcome everyone to the Positive Sobriety Institute and our Lunch and Learn. This is something we do jointly with the Department of Psychiatry at Northwestern, specifically the Addiction Psychiatry Division of Northwestern. So we co-sponsor these Lunch and Learns, and we're very glad you took some time to come and join us. We have a very, I think, important topic today, and a speaker that Bogdan that has done an enormous amount for many of our participants and licensed professionals throughout the state. Dr. Bogdan is a registered pharmacist and an attorney. I received his Pharmaceutical Doctorate degree from the University of Illinois at Chicago College of Pharmacy. He obtained Juris Doctorate from the John Marshall Law School, where he fulfilled his legal education during the evenings. On graduating from law school, Dr. Bogdan worked for the state of Illinois as a chief of prosecutions within the health-related office of the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation, or IDFPR. After his employment as a chief of prosecutions, he then went to work for the Illinois Department of Public Health, where he worked as both the chief pharmacist of the state of Illinois and deputy director of emergency preparedness and response. After his tenure with the state of Illinois, he's worked as the National General Counsel for a major pharmacy chain. Currently, he is in private practice for the past 15 years. His practice focuses on healthcare entities and provider regulatory law. Specifically, his practice focuses on healthcare provider licensure issues with state boards, the DEA, healthcare professional hospital privileges, and their provider enrollment with private insurance companies, Medicaid and Medicare. Dr. Bogdan has committed his practice to the representation of healthcare providers with addictions. He volunteers his time and provides lectures to healthcare professionals, as he's doing with us, in recovery on subjects in reference to their licensure, hospital and insurance provider privileges. He has developed a proficiency and passion in representing healthcare providers with addictions, and as you can see in this bio, he has a very unique background that he himself is a healthcare professional, which is really a plus to have that personal and professional knowledge. And he has been, with regulatory entities, so he understands, the nuances that are so important in this regard. So with great pleasure and appreciation, I give you Dr. J. Bogdan.
Thank you, Dr. I think I got a mic on me. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for allowing me to come here to talk to you. What Dr. Angrist said, one of the things he had in the bio was about my passion for representing people who have addictions. The reason I developed that passion over the years is because when I was a prosecutor with professional regulations, I'd prosecute nurses, pharmacists, physicians, whoever. And when the person would come in, even with a lawyer, they didn't know what was going on. They didn't realize what was possibly coming their way as a result relative to the discipline of their license that we were about to impose as a result of their addiction. So over time, what I did when I left the state, I said to myself, listen, I want to try to help these people. So I volunteered at different recovery programs. I'd come in once a month, and I would just talk to the group about basically what we're talking about today. What could happen to their license as a result of whatever their issue was with addiction. I did that because I felt people needed help. They don't know, by the time they present themselves to a place like here, or they call me as a lawyer after they get out of here, while they're here, or whenever, they're down here in their life. And I felt if I can help them and maybe tell them, here's what could come your way, and you need to be prepared. Get recovered, get better, get treatment, but realize down the line this might be coming your way. So that's one of the reasons I got involved, was to try to help these people that are going through this. But here's a little bit. Dr. Angrist explained a little bit about my education and work history. I used to be prosecution with professional regulations. Department of Financial Professional Regulations in Illinois, as in other states, regulate healthcare professionals. They regulate healthcare professionals, how they practice. Every profession in Illinois and other states has their own practice act, such as the Medical Practice Act, Pharmacy Practice Act, and rules. They also have controlled substances that they have to deal with act and rules within each state. So I would prosecute healthcare professionals based upon that. Did they violate the Practice Act? If I felt they did, we would then prosecute the individual's license. Everything in the prosecutions had to do with their license for the most part. If there was never criminal intent involved or criminal prosecution, that's for the state's attorney's office, maybe the DEA, some other agencies to get involved. Ours was really regulating based on their license, and that was kind of what we would go after. I also teach pharmacy law at various schools, so if I start writing on this board, you'll know why I'm doing it. I guess I'm used to it when I teach individuals. What we're going to cover today, a little bit about opioid epidemics, controlled substance issues in healthcare professionals, regulators, in other words, who's regulating the healthcare professionals when it comes to their addiction. It's not just states, it could be the federal government, could be Medicaid, could be other things like that. Some definitions as far as public terms. We're going to talk a little bit about different types of disciplines that can be imposed on someone's license, whether it's a public or non-public, and we'll get into differentiation of those and what they are. And then I got at the end what's called an Office of Inspector General. I'll introduce that later, but basically there's a state Office of Inspector General and a federal. And healthcare providers can be excluded from various plans or Medicaid, Medicare, based on what the Office of Inspector General can do or wants to do. If anybody has any questions, stop me. So just feel free to raise your hand. But the purpose is to make individuals aware of potential legal financial implications, meaning if you don't have a license, you're possibly not going to be able to work, right? Your income is going to be taken away. That individual's income. The other thing, too, I believe, in my experience, is early legal intervention is important for people going through recovery or addictions. What I want to do, really, the purpose of this is to make people that provide care to these addicted, these people coming through this program or whoever, make them aware of what could possibly happen to their license. I get a lot of phone calls from Illinois Professionals Health Program, for example. Other people, other counselors will say, hey, I have a client doing this, this, and this. So the purpose of today's presentation is maybe to explain to you a little bit more when you work with your patients about what could come their way as a result of what's going on in their life at this point. So in my opinion, addiction is an illness and affects everyone, not just the individual, their family, whoever they work with, their employment. Unfortunately, who's afflicted with an addiction can have their ability to work impacted by all these regulatory agencies. Many, if not all, seek treatment are unaware. As I told you before, the reason why I got into this is because people aren't aware of what's coming their way, unfortunately. And then their ability to practice in the future could be impaired due to whatever happens to their license. If someone gets a public discipline on their license, a nurse, a doctor, a pharmacist, it could be very challenging for him or her to get employment. That's the reality of it. Well, this is a quick slide on opioid abuse. I throw this in there because it's such a hot topic. But a substance misuse and addiction among healthcare professionals is about the same as a general population. Substance misuse includes alcohol. But if we look more into opioids, prescription drug abuse, our rates are 5 times higher with physicians. You guys probably know this data better than I do. 10% of studies have shown of healthcare professionals misuse controlled substances. And then the Nursing Association says nurses about 10%, according to the data they have. It's possible, common controlled issues in healthcare, it's almost impossible to list all the existing controlled substance issues found in healthcare professionals. Addiction, as you know, relative, it's not just opioids, right? It could be benzodiazepines. It could be a Concerta or some sort of Adderall type thing, methylphenidate. People can get addicted to those too, and that's of concern. So what it talks about, we're going to get into the next couple slides, is the issues relative to people that may have an addiction, the issues relative to their practice, the addiction and abuse potential, but also misconduct. People can get in trouble for, improper record keeping, that type of misconduct. Addiction, as I said earlier, it can be to controlled substances, alcohol, or illegal drugs. Cocaine, heroin, we've had clients on that before, those kind of things. What happens many times with addiction is people end up diverting it addiction can be shown in many ways in somebody, whether they're diverting medications, whether they got caught driving under the influence. Maybe it's the first time they got caught, but they may have a problem with alcohol. Marijuana possession, controlled substance without a valid prescription. Some of the things about diversion, what I want to share is, the nurse that takes stuff out of an Omnicell, the nurse that doesn't document that they gave the patient or they gave the full dose, but they didn't. You have diversion occurs in many ways. It's not just grabbing stuff and leaving. I've had pharmacy technicians where the patient needs 120 Norco and they give them 110, and they're pocketing 10. So diversion occurs in many different ways. Obviously, this type of thing is possession of controlled substances is people who write scripts for themselves. I've had physicians write scripts for their mother-in-law, pick it up, and they end up taking it for themselves. That's what the definition of diversion is: illicit drugs for illicit purposes. In other words, taking drugs from legal and medically necessary uses and then in ways that are illegal or not medically authorized or necessary. Those examples I just gave you about the technician, the pharmacist, the nurse, the physician, those are examples of misuse. The most common thing that addiction is with nurses, the most common profession. A lot of these professions, in my opinion, from what I've heard, read in the data, you know more than I do, the professionals that are highest addiction rates, most that I've seen are nurses, physicians, and pharmacists, nurse anesthetists, anesthesiologists. And a lot of that is because of the access. They have access to the drugs. The pharmacist, I've talked to Wally Cross about this, and you go behind the counter, you've got all these controlled substances around. Nurses have access to Omnicells. The anesthesiologists have access to the meds while they're giving it to the patient while they're under. The last thing I saw in last IDFPR enforcement report, this is the numbers, almost 20% of all nurses' cases dealt with substance abuse. And the same report, medical cases dealt with substance abuse and addiction as far as physician goes. So numbers are up there. Now these numbers, and you know as well as I, these may be low. People don't get caught, they don't get reported. So it might be a lower number, it probably is, relative to the reality. Sometimes addictions can lead to professional misconduct. Not just showing up impaired to work, but nurses' cases are related to controlled substances. Many times we get cases of nurses, they don't say the person diverted, the nurse did, but their record keeping was off. In other words, the nurse didn't document that they gave the meds to the patient. Or they documented they grabbed it, but they never put it through the computer that they actually administered to the patient. There's record keeping like that they accuse nurses of. 13% of medical cases, physicians dealt with professional misconduct, as I said before. There's such as overprescribing. A lot of people get addicted because they're overprescribed drugs, healthcare professionals. Some things as far as when the addicted professional is working, they might inappropriately prescribe drugs to patients. They may not take proper notes. They're letting their guard down a little bit. They're not practicing at the level they should as a result of their addiction. So not only may they get in trouble with the board as far as their addiction itself, but they may get in trouble with the board as a result of their practice because of their addiction. There's different types of agencies that affect someone's abilities to practice. Now I was going to use this real quick. You've got the state, two agencies basically. I think I went ahead of myself. You've got the state, and then you could have the federal government, right? In the state is where you have I'll say Department of Professional Regulations. These are DPR, right? You could have an OIG also, Office of Inspector General, that could regulate someone's license or ability to practice. The federal government, the main one I see when people are involved with addictions or something, is the DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration. That's a U.S. government agency that only regulates controlled substances. They don't regulate blood pressure meds or anything like that. And then you could also have what's called a federal OIG, which affects Medicare and Medicaid. But what people don't realize is practitioners, predominantly these are the ones, the state is the one that goes after a healthcare practitioner or regulates them. I shouldn't say go after them, but regulate them. But the DEA can get involved too, and we'll talk about that later. But also you have hospitals. People, as a result of their addictions, after they maybe get caught by the state, The state reports them to third-party providers, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Medicare, things like that. Sometimes employers can file a complaint. Hospitals can file complaints. All this stuff. Complaints against licensees. When it comes to a complaint against a healthcare provider, these are the ways complaints are filed, or the means by which they can be filed. A citizen or a patient can complain. I've had cases where patients have complained where the person didn't appear up to par, the doctor who was rounding on them or whoever saw them in the practice. Nurses. It seems more and more I see that nurses will report healthcare professionals. People are showing up at the ER, whatever, the doctor, and they're showing up impaired. Somebody's going to report them. Actually, someone they work with. Insurance companies, hospitals, state and federal agencies can also file complaints. What happens with these, and this is what I'm getting at, you could have many cases in one. You could have a criminal case tied in with somebody who gets arrested with possession of whatever, cocaine. The police then might report them to the state. The state then could report them to other agencies. It could be a whole domino effect with these kind of things. And they all report, they share information with each other. In Illinois, I know the DEA works very closely with professional regulations. They get in touch and they work on cases and all that. You can have governmental agencies file complaints. The Attorney General's Office, Department of Public Health, sometimes the local police. I've had a guy who got a DUI in the police. He wasn't very cooperative. Well, they reported him to professional regulations. As I mentioned, the DEA, the OIG, and the FBI, they can all work together in a case. And when I say a case, what I'm talking about is a case obviously against an individual, which means their registration with the DEA. There's two different outcomes with these cases when it comes at least to professional regulations. And this could apply in other states too. It could go down the path I tell my clients, because they'll say to me before I start working with them, they'll say, what could happen to my license? And I'll say, well, it could go one of two ways. Or it can get dismissed, right, or non-public discipline, meaning it's between the client, myself, and their department they're in front of. Or there's a public discipline. It's on the website. It's for the world to look up. They do a credentialing check, background check, whatever for that individual. They're going to see a public discipline. We're going to go through these. But a non-public case could be dismissed. Maybe there were questionable evidence, questionable records, questionable investigation, where we could argue that it wasn't done right, or the person had nothing to do with it. I mean, we've had cases that have gotten dismissed by the boards. The Department of Professional Regulations can give what's called a warning letter. I mean, the FDA gives it, everybody gives warning letters. Basically, hey, you've appeared in front of the board, you've done something wrong, we're not going to give you any public discipline, but it's in a file. So if you reappear in front of this department or board again, you're on notice. We brought you here before. There's a non-disciplinary, which usually is a fine, where the person pays a, whatever, $500, $5,000 fine. And we'll get into what's called a care, counseling, and treatment a little bit later. That's another form of a non-public discipline. When we represent people in front of the boards, I mean, this is our goal. Obviously, we want to get it dismissed. Or if there's going to be a warning letter or what's called a care, counseling, and treatment, that's a good opportunity for someone to go ahead and work on their recovery and still be monitored by the department, but they don't have to tell employers, they don't have to tell anybody about it. But when you get in these public disciplines, again, which we'll get to, kind of from least to most, reprimand is the least. Then you have a probation, which could be a definite or indefinite period, a suspension, indefinite or indefinite, or revocation. Those are all on the website that are public, and I'll show you examples of that. So a reprimand, regulatory have the authority. There's types of disciplines. Professional regulators impose more. One of these, they can do more than one of these on someone. They can have a suspension tied in with a probation. Somebody might be suspended 6 months and then on probation for 5 years right after that. So you could have a combination. One of the things I want to share with you is the state and the government, federal government, DEA have the ability to refuse to issue a license or restore a license. Someone who's on probation, who wants to get off probation, has to file what's called a petition to restore. And when they file that, the state can say, we have to go in front of the board. We do mostly with the clients. They have a right to be heard. And they'll say, we're going to either restore the license off probation or leave it on probation. But you have to file what's called a petition to restore with that. So a reprimand, as I said, is the least, if we go back to this slide, it's the least harming of public disciplines. Not that public disciplines aren't harming, but it doesn't restrict anybody from working or doing what they would do. It's a record the licensee has been disciplined, but typically may not affect the status of their license or ability to practice. Regulatory will specify the conditions, but there are no conditions. But I put up here an example of someone here who got a reprimand. This is a public discipline of an example, and I have more for probation and suspension. But you'll see if someone looks up this license, and this is in Illinois, but if you looked in Indiana, Wisconsin, Florida, they all have this license lookup. You'll see this person was reprimanded, and the reason was due to providing a veterinary care and treatment that did not comply with standards of practice. In other words, the veterinary board, when this person presented to them, felt that they didn't fulfill the Veterinary Practice Act, or rules, whatever it was. Now, a probation is next more severe one, is basically what it says. Professionals are placed on probation, allowed to continue practicing subject to certain terms. Orders may vary in length, may be posed indefinitely, and at the end, the professionals, they're monitored by the probation's compliance unit. In Illinois, every state's compliance unit. What I'm getting at here is the probation can either be for an indefinite or definite. You could sit with the board, they'll say, we're going to give you a 5-year indefinite probation. That means that individual is on probation for 5 years, and we have to petition to restore to get them off probation. Or they might say, you've got a 3-year definite probation. In other words, that ends at the end of 3 years, and that's it. They can go to work and do all that. But during this probation terms, there's a lot of conditions. Many people in Illinois, they have to work with the Illinois Professionals Health Program, get an aftercare agreement, or adhere to an aftercare agreement, do caduceus meetings. There's all these terms within that aftercare agreement, AA meetings, whatever. Usually these probations follow those terms. They'll say, the aftercare agreement might say you got to be monitored 13 to 20 times a month for 3 years. It's going to follow the same thing for the most part. Well, I won't get ahead of myself. Here's an example of a probation. An individual, it says probation, diverted antibiotics and other supplies from her pharmacy employer. So someone's got a public discipline for taking Augmentin from their pharmacy, or whatever it is. But that doesn't go away. That's just, unfortunately, it doesn't go away their whole career. Suspension is what it is. You can't work while you're on suspension. A person can't work while they're on suspension. There's an indefinite suspension, specifies the conditions, when they can be off. Indefinite means what they have to do for that period. They have to petition back. Many times, to get their license back, many times these cases involve people who might have diverted some medication, really, number of times been caught. Somebody who gets a care counseling, a treatment we'll talk about, or maybe they're on a probation and they relapse. And during that time they test positive in their urine screen for whatever it is, they're going to be placed on suspension. Because the document, the conditions were if you violate this terms of this conditions of this probation, you're automatically suspended for a year. Here's another example of public discipline. This is all from IDFPR website. If you do a license lookup, you'd see these. But here it says suspension for whoever practitioner this was. I think it was a nurse. Failure to, this is not what we're talking about, but failure to pay state income taxes. We're going to get a slide I have a little bit, but people don't pay their state income. This has nothing to do with what we're talking about, but if people don't pay their state income taxes or child support, the state can take their license away. Revocation basically is the worst. It's a year, minimum of a year. People will say, well, I want to petition, get my license off revocation. It's been 6 months. We could try. It's kind of an unwritten rule. It's for a year. And then you go from a revocation more than likely to a probation. Suspension could be from 1 month up to a year, but a revocation is minimum a year. I talked earlier about the non-discipline orders and a fine. Fines are in place because they have to pay money. Sometimes they'll say, we're putting you on probation, but we're going to give you a $5,000 fine. Sometimes money hurts. Obviously, money hurts anybody, right? Here's an example of a fine and a reprimand together. You could, as I said, you could have some of these things combined, these disciplines. Lawsuit, this was a doctor after he settled a lawsuit alleging he failed to admit a patient with pancreatitis. And it's the same thing. So he got a reprimand and, or she, I shouldn't say he, but could be one or the other. He or she got a fine and a reprimand at the same time. A public discipline. This is the one that, you know, if I have someone who's presenting to me or wants to retain me who has an addiction, my goal, I know they're going to have to be monitored. The state or whoever they're in front of is not going to, more than likely going to say you have to be monitored, depending on what stage they're in their addiction. You know, if they're, I won't get into what I was going to say, but care, counseling, and treatment is a non-public means to monitor these patients with a probation. Or I'll call them clients, you call them patients. For some healthcare professionals, they may require to enroll in a care, counseling, and treatment. It's similar to a probation. It's a one-time offer. The Nurse Practice Act says if you self-report and your addiction or whatever related to that, you're entitled to get a CCT. It depends on the facts, obviously, care, counseling, and treatment. That's an offer they make. The department will do that oftentimes with many professionals, because professionals will say to me, well, should I self-report? And they want to think maybe they'll get away with it, right? And they might. Someone might not report them to the department. But oftentimes I'll say, well, if you self-report, for example, with a nurse who got caught, dipping into the Omnicell or whatever it is, or Pyxis machine, if you self-report before your employer comes forward to the department, we're going to have a chance to get this. And it's like another bite at the apple. They're going to have to be monitored. They're going to have to go through drug screens. They're going to have to call in every day and say, you got to give a urine specimen today or you don't. Today's not your day. They're going to have to go to caduceus meetings. But it's a good thing. It's an outcome that we strive for in those types of patients, or clients. I say patients as a pharmacist, but I should say clients, right? So here's the reasons why people can get addicted. I threw some things about addictions, also some other reasons. But this is a collection of all the practice acts, basically. Physician Medical Act, Pharmacy Act, Nursing Act, whatever, Physician Assistant Act. But the reason someone's license can be disciplined by their board or the department is because excessive use or abuse of controlled substance that may affect the judgment. This was a physician. Their addiction may lead to a pattern of behavior, which they show up impaired or whatever. They can't make decisions they need to, or they don't. Obviously, you've seen it. We've had people who self-administer drugs to themselves while they're at work. Unprofessional conduct. There's willful, wanton, repeated. This was always a catch-all. When I was a prosecutor, I'd write a complaint against someone or file against a nurse or doctor. You'd say, well, my attitude was if you violated this, you were acting unprofessional. Which, that's a tough argument to say you weren't, or the person wasn't. People make misrepresentations. People will say to me, like I have a guy just now, I got a DUI, do I need to report it? Do I report it on my renewal? I'm not going to say no. It's his choice, her choice. But some people will say, I'm not going to do it because I don't think I'll get caught. But if they get caught, they're misrepresenting that they never got the DUI to the department. Pattern of conduct. Obviously, if someone's impaired or has an addiction, they can't practice at the level they should, maybe. Oftentimes, obviously, there's functional people, but some people aren't. Again, here's this deceive or defraud. They're holding themselves out as somebody who's practicing at the level they should, but they might not be. This is called a sister state discipline. We have a lot of people like in Illinois and Missouri, because St. Louis is right there. They'll have a license in Illinois. They'll have a pharmacist license in Missouri. If Missouri gives them a discipline for whatever reason, then Illinois has a right to give them a sister state or discipline in another state. So if someone gets a probation in Missouri, they're going to be on probation in Illinois. The sister state discipline, that's the way the laws are written. And the other discipline, as I said before, if somebody relapses, tests positive for whatever their issue was, their drug of choice, then they're going to have a suspension more than likely. Now this is where it gets into conviction of a crime or felony. Remember I told you we first started the domino effect, I'll call it, Poor lady, she's yawning on me. I'm kidding you. That's how I used to stay with my students when I was teaching. Not you, but it's whatever. But people who have like a misdemeanor related to possession of a controlled substance, they get pulled over and they've got a bag of marijuana or they got some whatever, pills. I had a student who had in an amber vial with no label, 3 or 4 Adderall pills. So you wonder what happened. He got pulled over for a speeding ticket. Police said, what is that? And it was downhill from there. But what that person doesn't realize is now a conviction for that can now lead to a prosecution of his license or her license. Someone gets a DUI, right? That could lead to some sort of a discipline on their license. You know, people who get DUIs, I'm getting off the subject, but they say on the billboard, it'll say $10,000 mistake, right? That's just their criminal stuff. But you have that, then you throw in, I shouldn't say this, my fees, right? But, and all the stuff that goes with it, that's an expensive DUI. And people who, obviously, anybody who has a license, I mean, I'm a pharmacist like Dr. You're not going to give that up easy. You work hard for it, and there's your livelihood. So it's an expensive mistake. This is before inability of practice, records, mention of this. I mentioned this about student loans and all. I don't know why I threw it on there, but it's just an interesting thing, I guess. Boards also consider for disciplines. When we go with a client, there's 2 ways the path this case could go. There's a formal hearing where you go in front of an administrative law judge, you bring in discovery, witnesses, all that stuff. And then there's where you meet with the board itself, where I go with the individual and we sit in a room, whatever. We talk to the board and the individual and myself and the prosecuting attorney, and we try to work this case out. They'll say at the time, and I'm kind of deals with this, but this what they're looking at, they'll say, okay, let us talk about, we learned about the facts, we got everything. Obviously, the department's done their investigation. We step outside, we come in, and they say, here's our offer. You don't have to accept it. You could go down the path of a formal hearing, whatever you want. But this is what the boards look at when you meet with them. Or if you might have gone through a formal hearing, they're going to look at the whole case itself, and they're going to say, okay, we want to discipline this person because they breached the code of ethics. Every profession has its own code of ethics, and they think they violated it, they're going to discipline them. Obviously, the things about patience and violating laws, things like that. So I talked about the state. We got the OIG I've been talking about. Now the federal government is the DEA. The DEA cases deal with people that prescribe, basically. Your physicians, right? Your MDs, DOs, your mid-level practitioners, your nurse practitioners, PAs, or whatever, advanced practice nurses, and CRNAs. All those individuals have a DEA number, registration. They also have a license through the Department of Professional Regulations and a controlled substance license. But the DEA can prosecute someone on its own. They'll go after people who are over-prescribing. They'll track physicians, nurse practitioners that are outliers according to their data because they have electronic tracking methods that they're outliers of prescription writers. Some people write more Norco than anyone else in the neighborhood. The DEA may go knock on their door. But these 2 agencies work together. But the DEA, really they're in charge of controlled substances. That's all they regulate, whether it's street drugs or controlled substances, Xanax, whatever, Valium, whatever. But they're there, obviously, everyone's there to protect the public and the safety. But the DEA, if this person has their registration number, the prescriber, if that's taken away, that's very hard because now the state's going to come after them. If this thing's revoked or taken away or willfully turned over, we'll get into this called 104 form, it's a problem. And some people may be overprescribing because, well, the patients they're seeing, maybe they're doing it for themselves. I don't know. But that's just something to consider. So grounds for denial, the DEA has the rights to say when somebody applies for a license or someone renews, I think it's every 2 or 3 years, they renew their DEA registration. If that individual's been convicted of a felony related to controlled substances, the DEA can say, we're putting a stop on this application, or we're not going to renew this license, this registration. As I said before, has a state license suspended or revoked to deal with controlled substances. A common practice is they'll say, we're going to take away your controlled substance license, and then these people are coming right behind it. They're all connected, which they should be, because they're all regulating these people. I have this 104 form as a voluntary surrender. Many times the DEA, not many times, the DEA will go in there and say, sign the 104 form. Just, it's okay, you'll get your registration back. It's going to be a long time till you get it back. Basically what the person is doing, the prescriber is, they're signing over their registration voluntarily, and they're saying the minute they give it to the DEA, it goes into effect. And they can't, it's gone. No more prescribing controlled substances. The other thing with the DEA registration is, and people might not know this, but when it comes to practitioners, the credentialing with hospitals, having privileges, insurance companies want a DEA registration. It's a very, very hard thing to get over as a prescriber when that DEA number is removed. The state OIG I talked about in the federal, the Office of Inspector General, they regulate basically Medicaid in Illinois. Medicaid's a state-funded program, then Medicare is the federal. But it trains people to work with adults with disabilities. But what they'll do is they protect Medicaid. And you'll see here, some people, they can terminate someone to be a Medicare provider. If you go through here, down to the bottom, crimes involving controlled substances. People who get arrested, right, for obtaining controlled substances. People get arrested maybe for not prescribing controlled substance inappropriately. All those are reasons. The OIG can say to them, the state OIG, Office of Inspector General, we're going to terminate you as a Medicaid provider. So no longer seeing Medicaid patients. You won't get paid for them. You can see them, but you won't get paid through Medicaid. The problem with that is, again, all these agencies work together. All these departments work with these agencies. So now you have the federal OIG coming up. And the Federal Office of Inspector General regulates Medicare, and it's to protect the people who are getting paid, or they're seeing their patients, to make sure those patients are getting good care. But what the federal government will look, they look at enrollment. In other words, every provider has to enroll in Medicare to be a provider for Medicare patients, whether they're seeing them as a physician or whatever, a pharmacy, whatever. But that person or entity can be excluded. In other words, a physician could go on with their practice for 20 years and be a Medicare provider. All of a sudden he or she has some problem with controlled substances or whatever reason, the DEA or the OIG at that point can say, we're going to exclude that person going forward for a certain time frame and not going to pay that person for Medicare, Medicaid patients treatment. And so that's what we're getting at here, exclusions. When I share with people going through the program, when I talk to them, I let them know about this. I let them know because what you're going to do is, you're going to get a letter, which anyone will go through this. You get a MEL, mitigation exclusion letter. People, I've had so many clients get that, and they're like, I don't know what it was, so I pitched it. Well, it was a letter from OIG saying, listen, you're on notice. We found you did this and that. You better tell us a reason why we're not going to exclude you when you have a chance to be heard for, I think it's 45 days. If you miss that 45 days, you're placed on this notice of exclusion list. It's online. And once they're on there, they're placed on that list. They can't work at a facility or employer or get paid for Medicare, Medicaid, or veterans, TRICARE program. But in the letter it says, the scope to the person, the scope of the exclusions is broad and if implemented will have a significant effect on your ability to work in the healthcare field. When people get on this list, they're being credentialed, and all of a sudden then people say, well, you're on this list, we're not going to hire you. It's not just getting paid, but it's also you're on this list. There's two forms of exclusion from the federal program. There's a mandatory and a permissible. Their time frames are longer or shorter, how long you're on that list. A mandatory exclusion results from such felony-related healthcare fraud or abuse of patients as a minimum of 5 years. Or permissible is 3 years. But it says here, I added, an individual who's convicted in a matter related to controlled substances will be on the exclusion list. Here's things for mandatory, 6 types for 5 years. Obviously, I look at this, and this goes too when it talks about a conviction. Many times people work with criminal lawyers, and the criminal lawyer will work down that path and solve that criminal case. But what that criminal lawyer doesn't realize is that it's a healthcare professional and their ability to practice and their license and involvement with is impacted by that final decision. So they'll say, well, just take a plea. And they do. And then they call me and it's like, well, you pled guilty. You're convicted. It's hard to fight it. So what I'll do, and I think I have this on another slide, we'll try to work with those criminal lawyers together. So we'll say, okay, criminal lawyer, you go ahead, you prosecute this case, work with me because I know how their license is going to be impacted based on where this case ends. Let's try to get the best outcome for the criminal thing because eventually the department or whoever, the state's going to find out. So you want to try to protect that license in any way you can. But this here, again, 5 years, felony conviction related to controlled substances. Permissive, again, it's all that stuff, but we have controlled substances here, a misdemeanor. You have your felony level cases, you have your misdemeanor cases. Misdemeanors are lower in essence than felony, depending on the situation. But even someone who gets a misdemeanor conviction, it's 3 years excluded. So this is my point. I'm wrapping this up, but what I tell people, and I'll tell people this in general, anybody, and it's not because I'm a lawyer and I want business or whatever, but the reality is if you appear in front of a regulatory agency, somebody with a healthcare license, probably should have a lawyer. People go in it alone. They think it's informal. Next thing you know, I'll get a call after the fact. They've been quashed by them. The prosecutor's beaten down. And they're like, I don't know what happened. Well, they shouldn't have gone in there alone because you don't know what the outcome is. And I'll say the same thing as in criminal cases. When I talk to groups in recovery, I'll say, when I get to this point, when you get caught finally, for whatever reason, whether your employer, the cops, police comes in the pharmacy, they arrest you, the nurse, the DA, you don't want to say, you're like, okay, most people will say, they're relieved. Some people tell me they're relieved when they get caught because now they got treatment and they're doing better. But what they don't realize, they might be relieved, but you've got this license thing coming 3, 4, 5, 6 months later. And so I say, like I said when I started, when you're down here, you hopefully have the wits to say, you know what, I'm not saying anything. Because they'll take a loss prevention. I've seen it with hospitals, with pharmacies. Just write down what you took. We're here to help you. That's not going to happen. Maybe, but I doubt it. We're here to help you, but in the meantime, they're going to report you to the department, maybe call the cops, whatever it is you're dealing with. So I say you don't admit to it. Get a lawyer, let them do your talking for you. Obtain proper legal representation. I use the example of, when I was a prosecutor, I asked this guy, I was with the doctor, I said, what kind of lawyer? Well, I'm his divorce lawyer. I'm like, oh, okay. But the point is you want to get a proper lawyer to handle whatever situation you have, that person has. You should pay attention to the mail, the patient should, for that mitigation for the OIG information. Drug must be reported. They'll say when people get caught at work, in the hospital, show up impaired or whatever, that institution has an obligation to report them to the state Department of Professional Regulations. And then they'll determine the supervision or rehab program. This is what I said, as I've said all along. People who are going through programs, whether their employer reports them or not or whatever, many times will have a issue with the department or their license or the DEA. I say this, what I was saying, if they have a criminal background or case, they should get a criminal lawyer to work on that case and someone in regulatory background to work to help protect their license. Attorneys, this is just ARDC. It's important for a patient to be aware of potential effects their past actions may have on their future ability. I was thinking in conclusion, I'll leave on this. When I was doing these lectures, I still do to people in recovery, I'm thinking I was doing this for 14 years. I used to go every month, volunteer, just talk to these people. And I learned through all that about people who, when I got done talking to them, at the end I'd say, all right, I'm going to go. And I'd have people, 3, 4, 5 people line up, 2, whatever. Every time at least 1 or 2 people would say to me, if I would have known what you just shared with me in this hour, before I put the script to the pad, before I put the code in the Omnicell, I wouldn't have done it. Obviously it's after the fact, but I guess where I'm going with this is, if you can share this information with your patients or think about it while you're talking to them, whatever they should be concerned with, then I guess we have a good day, right? So with that said, I don't know if anybody has any questions. Otherwise, thank you. Yes.
You know, I've been working with IDFPR for decades.
Mm-hmm.
I won't say how many.
I know, I remember seeing you there. Of course, as a representing somebody, right?
But it seems as though, you know, there's a pendulum that swings
Right.
that you can see over time. I see it in other states. It seems that like the last few years, IDFPR has gotten much more punitive than I've ever remembered. Have you experienced that? And if so, why do you think it is?
Why I think it may be, first off, and I don't mean it, I don't know how to say this without saying it, but wrongly, but I think a lot of the punitive side of it, obviously this case by case, maybe it's representation, I don't know. I mean, you know, it's like a whatever. I don't know as punitive, I mean, we've had some things where I'm like, you know, I'm really surprised with the outcome in a good way. I know it swings with administrations. In other words, you just had the Rauner people running the show. Now you've got the new governor, Pritzker's people running the show. They have different attitudes, different values, different thoughts towards public health regulation, whatever. So I think that's it. I also think, depending on the publicity the department has, you know, in the past they've had things about doctors that were working that should have been working and all that. Well, of course, the pendulum's going to swing way over. So I think that's it. But I think a lot of it, and I don't know, I don't mean it depends on who you have representing them, I think, and I can't say it's swinging more now. It just seems like it's kind of been consistent, at least since this administration's been in. I didn't answer your question, but I don't know what else to answer, I'll be honest with you. I'm just telling you, I mean, honestly, I think it's, a lot of it could be the representation. And I don't mean to sound that, but of course I'm not going to say, hey, I could get this person off who just got arrested with 8 pounds of marijuana driving from Iowa, you know, or California. I'm not going to expect that. But I do think some things, you know, depends on the strategy and the tactics. And the other thing I'll say, just in my opinion, it's how you present the case. You know, I can say I've done this long enough, like I tell people that I work with in different various capacities, associations or recovery programs, how do you present that person to the board? You know, if you go in there with someone you're representing, and I've seen it, lawyers, first time they meet them is in the Thompson Center outside the room, and it's the first time they met them, and you're going from the medical board. I'm like, no, you've got to have, you know, letters of recommendation. You've got to have letters from people like you or whoever, Janet Pickett, and, you know, say aftercare, caduceus, AA record, all this stuff. You got to work the case. And when you throw it in front of them, you say, hey, this person's in the right direction. Sure, the mistake happened. The other problem is the mistake happened a year ago, and now they're finally getting to it. So you have to try to argue that person's got a year of recovery under their belt. Let's take this into consideration. So I think a lot of it is how you work the case up. And again, I don't know if it answers your question, but it just seems, it's like healthcare. Well, you know, with health, if you work a case up someone well, they have a better chance of recovering than if you don't do it right. So.